Okay, great. So hello everyone and welcome. My name is Odanga Madung. I am a fellow I'm a technology and human rights fellow here at the Carr-Ryan Center here at the Harvard Kennedy School. And with me today, I am joined by Hanifa Adan and John Alan Namu to have a discussion about the state of rights in the world, but most, of course, but largely focusing and looking into the rise of repression within East Africa. So I'll just maybe just give a chance to Hanifa and John to maybe just say a few short words about themselves. Then I can go ahead and just deliver a bit of context setting as to why we exactly we're having this conversation and what we hope to get out of it. And then I think we can move from there. So of course, ladies first. So Hanifa, please go ahead and introduce yourself to our audience. And then I think we can go ahead from them to John and then we start. Yeah.
Hello, guys. My name is Hanifa Aden. I'm a journalist by profession and also a human rights defender. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. My name is John Alan Namu. I am an investigative journalist, a co-founder of Africa Uncensored. Right now, I'm a John S. Knight Fellow at Stanford, thinking about big problems in journalism that I can take back to my country. I'm glad to be here. Or rather, solutions I can take back to the country, not the problems.
Yeah, because
we
it
have
looks
enough
like
problems.
Yeah, like we have enough problems. Why are we carrying our problems back to back to Kenya?
Yeah.
But thank you, thanks a lot to both of you for joining us in this conversation. I think for me, it's very important to state that here at the Carr-Ryan Center, one of the things we've been really thinking about is, of course, the state of rights in the world. And in light of the recent upheavals that we have seen globally with regards to the rise of youth movements and a lot of young people seeking to upset the balance of power and get a seat at the table, we started having a conversation here with our director Matthias Rees about the state of youth movements, largely not just the state of youth movements in Africa. And one of the things that we've seen is, especially across the continent, is, from Madagascar to Kenya to Senegal, and even beyond the continent, looking at Nepal and Bangladesh, is that, yes, youth movements have come to rise to the fore, but they have also equally been met with very harsh repression and a very harsh pushback from incumbents that have been keen to try and keep them from either bubbling over or achieving the goals of their actions. And so this comes, of course, amidst in an environment in the world where we could largely say that there has been significant amounts of democratic backsliding. And I think Freedom House, if I'm not wrong, are the ones that recently according to recent research that they released, established that, I think more than ever across the world, people are living under authoritarian rule. And so when we think about the whole idea that, human dignity, especially within this moment in time, has largely taken a backseat, or rather, when you consider the narratives and the talking points of a lot of global leaders across the world. And transactionalism is largely and plainly on the table. And I dare say even colonialism seems to be back on the table. And so for me, this is going to be largely a conversation about the state of rights and movements in the world, considering, of course, the backdrop of what is happening across a lot of multilateral institutions that are all over the globe, but also considering East Africa as the microcosm of what is going on, or what we're all experiencing. And of course, we'll start this series by looking at Kenya, which is why we have the two of you, arguably looking at the dark turn that the country has taken with regards to repression, particularly after the Gen Z uprising of 2024. Which has largely seen, of course, hundreds of people abducted or killed by police on the streets during protests, and also witnessed the country's first internet shutdown. Yeah. And so I think I'm just going to start off the conversation by asking Hanifa, just for the audiences, of course, to lay it out for us, at least with regards to the audience, could you walk us through what sparked the Gen Z protests? of 2024, and how did they evolve, and where is that movement now? Could you just maybe set that tone for our audience and maybe help us understand, why exactly we are at this point in time? Yeah.
Yes, of course. Thank you, Odanga. So the Gen Z uprising in 2024, in simple terms, started with the finance bill. People started talking about the finance bill that year and how it was going to affect any common ordinary citizen. So the bill was going to make our lives very difficult. Usually Kenyans were not, okay, from the previous years before 2024, we were really not quite involved politically, especially the young generation. So 2024 saw the largest youth-led movement in Kenya, sparked by the finance bill, which was going to overtask us. It was going for basic commodities like pads, sugar, bread, everything. So it got everyone involved. People started talking about it on TikTok. They even translated it into different languages, they translated it into different languages. So conversations around it started. Honestly, no one anticipated what would have happened the following days. We were just angry at the bill, angry at how the duty bearers have for decades ignored us, our voices. Our members of parliament are supposed to represent us, our interests, but they were still tone deaf to our concerns. That is when we took everything into our hands. We started sharing their numbers and telling them to reject the bill. So the conversation started around there. The spark actually started around there. It's what we call in Kenya kusalimia, translating to greetings. So we were offering them holy greetings, telling them to vote no to the bill. But as usual, they were very ignorant. By the arrogance, I mean, they were the arrogance part is what really sparked the 2024 protest. You would message them and they would arrogantly reply to you, which does not make sense. You are supposed to represent my interest in parliament, not the interest of the state and not the interest of the president. So they did not want to hear it. That is why we took it to the street. So the mood was there. The tone was set. The first day we went to the street was on June 20th. That was such a small protest for starters. We were the first protesters and we got immediately arrested. Mind you, we still did not anticipate what would happen next. So I believe the finance bill was just a catalyst. The protest was largely because of unemployment, inequality, corruption, years of simmering anger and frustration, that made everyone lose their minds. The finance bill just came to warm us up. So we went to the streets. On June 25th was the biggest protest in Kenya that unfortunately also saw the loss of so many lives. It was such a hectic day for us. Of course, it was historic. It was the day when the bill was, the final voting of the bill. We were around parliament as well. We were still telling them to vote no to the bill, but they did not listen. So immediately we heard that the bill was passed is when we lost it all. So we had the youth storming parliament, asking them, it was a holy greeting again, asking them why they voted yes to the bill. So unfortunately, we lost so many lives. It was a historic day, but also a very, very sad day for all of us. We still continued, They tried a lot. They tried to repress us. They tried to stifle dissent a lot through abduction. They would go for you and your family, of course. They would do anything, even the psychological war on social media. But it did not work. That is why the protest still went on until last year. It went on until last year during the first anniversary of 2024 protest. That also saw the loss of so many lives, unnecessary loss of lives. So we're still trying to get our way around this, trying to organize how best can we do this moving forward. And I love the idea of being leaderless. It gives everyone a chance to do what they do best in their own spaces. Each one of us is talented differently. That is why we had people in tech, people in medicine, lawyers, everyone was doing their part. That was the beauty of it, the solidarity. We fundraise millions to take care of those who are injured and those who had passed on. So I think that the solidarity is what kept the movement going. Anyway, we are still fighting. We are still moving forward with this, trying to organize again. Everyone is trying to see how best they can make this dream of a redefined Kenya come true, especially with the upcoming election. So I say the fight goes on.
Okay, thanks a lot for that introduction, Hanifa. And I mean, John, I think one of the things about that's been very unique and perhaps interesting about the uprising that happened in 2024 in particular in Kenya is that I think it's captured a lot of people's imaginations. I mean, in particular, I think it's captured very much the older generation's imagination in terms of they had never thought they would see this kind of agitation happen before. And so for me, my question to you is, was 2024 an event or a new era? And, to you, what proved this movement's power? And, what makes this particular moment or movement unique in Kenya's history of civic action?
I think that yes, the event itself was to borrow the words of the Canadian PM, a rupture in a sense, not a transition or a handing over of a fight that's been, as Hanifa explained, been here for decades, right? It was a rupture, a very loud rupture with the past, and I think one of the unique things about the 2024 protest was that the protesters themselves, coming from all walks of life, were able to organize in a public square that hadn't yet been captured or hadn't yet been paid attention to by the status quo, which is the digital space. So when Hanifa is referring to organizing on TikTok, having people create prompts on ChatGPT to explain the finance bill, organizing everything perhaps in plain sight, but out of sight of status quo, operatives that know how to clamp down on physical protests. That was a sign that things had shifted. That the kind of protests had shifted, but also the velocity of information and the use of information to be able to organize was something that especially people in government couldn't wrap their heads around. So that was a really important moment. Why it's such a powerful moment and why it is that I'd say it marks like a turning of the page is because for not the first time, but the first time in about a generation, Kenya is in step with the rest of the world in having this pain point being expressed in this way, and very loudly by a generation of people for whom the future doesn't look very, very promising. And I think that's the important thing. Whereas the trigger might have been the finance bill, the cause, the kindling, the firewood was years and years and years of inequality. And the fuel was years and years and years of corruption, elite capture, and the creation of one set of rules for one set of people and another set of rules for another. And I think that you see this around the world. And why I think this is going to continually be an issue is it goes down to one or two factors. I think the most important one to think about, for this conversation is just the age of the people who are on the streets, the age of the people who this debate affects. Africa's, we talk about Africa having this youth dividend, across the continent. But it means that in the living memory of millions of people, at least 65% of Kenya's population that are 18 and between 18 and 24, and three-quarters of the population that are 35 and below. This will be a marker in terms of how politics, how power has dealt with the question of resolving issues of inequality, injustice, especially economic inequality and the lack of opportunity in the country.
So I think the key, just to build on to your point, the issues that you've talked about, clamoring against them is not a bad thing. Yeah. So then why do we see the pattern of state violence during and after or towards people who talk about these things? Why does it make sense and I think coming down to the simplest question that perhaps I would want to ask in regards to this is, why does repression make sense to authoritarians? Especially in response to people asking for what they deserve. What exactly drives them towards this? And I think maybe if you can use this question to maybe expound more around the pattern of state violence in Kenya, and maybe Hanifa can also just chime in on this question as well. Yeah.
I think authoritarians use repression obviously as a stick and as a lever for them to be able to achieve their goals, but for the specific reason that it invokes fear, right? Fear is a very important principle in the rule book of an authoritarian because it suffocates the one thing that without it they cannot control, which is public debate, right? And this is why you started to see beyond the abductions, beyond the kidnappings, you started to see finger wagging at people who are shouting one term in bars, people who are organizing or starting to sloganeer during marathons, right? You start to see critique around that. You see the deployment of bots and bloggers online to ensure that that space is completely contested, right? And to ensure that the quality of information that gets to the public to then stir proper debate is completely muddied, right? But repression goes back long in various civilizations, but when it comes to Africa and the use of repression specifically by the state, this is a legacy of colonialism, right? When you create a state that is purely for extraction, right? The way to ensure that you protect that extraction, especially when the natives are restless, is fear, it's repression, it's violence, right? And you see a lot of this still on our rule books, still in our laws, still in the penal code. We have certain parts of our penal code that are being reviewed as recently as a week, 2 weeks ago. You're seeing judgments coming out about the penal code. What that means is that were it not for the fact that there are people who appreciate constitutionalism, repression is not just a tool, it's part of the law, it's part of the rule book in a very literal sense. So that's why they use it. I think what we should be careful about and why it is especially when it comes to this conversation is what methodologies are being borrowed, what methodologies are being transferred, and what are the goals, right? So in Tanzania, in Uganda, prior to the elections or any period where there's restlessness, the first thing that they do now is to shut down the internet. Yeah, and the internet needs to be seen for what it is, especially when it comes to the conversations around democracy, uncomfortable conversations. It's a public square, just like Uhuru Park is a public square where people would gather, right? So when you see things like that becoming part of becoming normalized, then you know that you are in or sleepwalking towards, a repressive authoritarian state, right? The sociologist Kim Lane Schleppel calls it the Franken state, right? Where you start to militarize or weaponize the law. You capture parliament, you capture institutions of security, and you then militarize them towards this goal of creating a state that doesn't that is alive in when you look at it from outward appearances, but its soul is dead because it serves only one specific objective.
Okay, great. And just moving to you, Hanifa, coming back to this question, and just if you can build on to what John has said, what is the function of fear? And just coming on to building on to the question that I had asked John around the same thing, why does authoritarianism make sense? Why does repression make sense to authoritarians?
Yeah.
I know you have a lot to say about fear. So yeah, please go ahead. Tell us about it. Yeah.
Yes, even from the very first protest, you could tell their main objective was to instill fear. I just got out of the car and the police came at me with so much force. He insulted me a lot. He took everyone there that was going to protest. So their objective was to scare us off. We were seen as clueless, mannerless kids who knew nothing about what was going on. So when we were arrested and people were being brought into the cell, we started singing, people were singing. Girls as young as 20 years old, 22 years old were in the cell with me. I was honestly really shocked. So it did not work. So if fear does not work, and I also think they resort to fear and repression because they want to guard their greed and incompetence. So Ruto dropped the finance bill after so many lives were lost, after a lot has happened. He could have honestly listened to the people. Thousands of youths were on the streets. So you did not think at all to listen to them. You just shot at them, and they had the police shot at innocent and armed protesters. You would rather kill them. You would rather see blood on the streets than listen to what thousands of youths, thousands of Kenyans are telling you. So if he wanted to listen to the people and to solve what was going on, he could have honestly done it. But when he came out a few days after the 25th election saying the finance bill was dropped, it was no longer about the finance bill. That is when we realized that these people do not mean well at all, that they would rather burn down the country than address our issues. So even in Tanzania and Uganda, especially Ugandans live in so much fear, such that you cannot even mention the president. I was in Uganda, so even if you start talking of politics, they ask if you've been sent by the government, just to test the waters to see where you stand. I don't know. They really do well with that. They understand how people move. And that is why I'm so proud of my generation. The fear, of course, people are scared of being killed, but we still show up. That is what matters, not to get scared at all. And I think people have had enough. People have reached a point where even fear does not work. It really does not work for them. So they resort to fear to guard their greed and incompetence, because I don't know, the corruption is too deep to the point that they can't even start undoing it. They cannot even settle for one good thing for the public because it's too deep. The corruption involves a lot of people. And I don't know, it's just too deep for them to ever fix it. That is where they all need to go. So, yeah.
That's actually a brilliant point, and just let me jump in there. And
sure.
if you look at what the economist and economic advisor to the president, David Ndii, says, he says that we will leave this country as corrupt as we found it. Our goal is development, and
Yes.
you have to think about why he's saying this, right? in the mind of an authoritarian, it's easier to develop than it is to have a conversation about democracy, about
Yes.
rights, about justice, because especially in the democratic experiment and then politics writ large, politics is the art of the possible, right? And I use that expression to mean that politics is a lot of horse trading, and you might paint this kind of very rosy picture for your people, but really when it comes down to it, the achieving the goals and walking towards this very rosy vision is much harder to do in practice if your politics works, if your democracy works, because there'll always be opposition, there'll always be questions from various quarters, as they should. It's an imperfect system. And that's why an authoritarian or somebody who is a benign dictator, right, would rather a transactional kind of leadership where it's, to use a Swahili expression, nipe nikupe. I give you, you give me. I scratch your back, you scratch mine. Over far more simple, far more material things. And the thing about material things, especially when it comes to politics, again, it's simplicity over nuance. I built that road. I can point to that road. You can't point to what democracy looks like or feels like, right? But you can point to a road, and that's much, much easier. I think, that's why it's easier to beat people into submission than it is to negotiate with them, especially when you're leading a country that has this legacy of issues. And this is why there's a very, very firm line. I think the firmest that I've seen in many generations to continually blame the past for the problems of the present. Even after Mwai Kibaki took power, that kind of like, hand wringing and crying about the sins of the past didn't go as far as it has like 3 years into the presidency. A lot of those grievances were then channeled into programs like programs or inquiries like the inquiry into land, right? So that there's an actual document. Whether it was acted upon is another issue, and those are the problems that that belong to the Kibaki regime. But if you see this continuous line of look at Uhuru, look at Kibaki, these are things that they got wrong. I'm the one who's fixing them, right? It tells you that there's a very, very firm recognition that if we keep people focused on the past, then the problems of today then do not become mine to own solely, in as much as you might have contributed to them. That's why I think authoritarianism, and you see this across every one of the East African countries, not just to focus on Kenya. You see Muhozi Kainerugaba saying, look at what Abiy Ahmed has achieved. Like, we need more time to be able to achieve what Abiy Ahmed has achieved. Never mind that his father has been in president since I was 3 years old, right? And I'm not a young man. You understand? So they're continuously sort of like telling people to bargain with the past and to borrow time and to transact with them, but not to debate with them. And that's the problem that we have, because we have a population of people who are watching what's happening around the world, right? And they no longer want to have this debate with the past. They're talking about a debate with the future.
Okay, thanks. I think you made an interesting reference there, saying that you've seen a different Ugandan president except Museveni, which tells us how old, which tells us how old you are. But I think just segueing very much into talking about East Africa, which I think is central to this question, because one of the things, and I'm going to bring out two things here that perhaps will help us guide how we go into this conversation, which is, one of the biggest trends in authoritarianism right now is that authoritarian strongmen are not necessarily coming into power by solely being supported by themselves, right? The latest trend in authoritarianism, as we're beginning to see, is that authoritarians are developing networks, right? That they are not just ruling alone, but they're ruling in cliques, right? They are able to develop ecosystems of repression that then, for example, number one, I think sort of dissolve borders and sort of dissolve borders and expand, you almost create a limitless element to repression, right? And I think for me, one of the things I think I remember hearing recently was that there has never been as much talk in the world about borders as there is right now, right? But we've never seen repression also go across borders as much as we are actually seeing right now. This is one of those interesting, especially within East Africa, that I think we've seen a very not interesting, but very peculiar response to youth agitation and movements across, particularly Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania, which is, of course, the nature of cross-border abductions that we've been seeing since 2024. That's the first thing. The second thing, of course, is the revelations that have come out this week around the installation of spyware. And I'll just give a shout out to Jonathan Rosen, who I think is on the call and is also a fellow here at the Carr-Ryan Center, who there's been an entire amount of investigations that have been carried out looking into the installation of spyware on human rights defenders' phones, right? And the revelations have not just come out and implicated Kenya's government, but we are seeing that I think journalists from Botswana are also being targeted. Yeah, and this speaks again to the whole aspect of shared authoritarian tactics. And so I just wanted to get a sense from all of you, at least from the both of you, and maybe we can start with you, Hanifa, around what reason do you believe that there could be collaboration between a lot of authoritarians across the world? And because we've aptly named this session "Are All African Authoritarians in One WhatsApp Group?" So maybe could you expound on that metaphor a bit in terms of looking into the network, and also maybe touch a bit on the surveillance trends that we've seen, and what you feel about them? Because I think that, ideally, I'm sure both of you are actually actively watching your backs and really thinking about, always looking at your phones and thinking to yourselves, yeah, what if I'm compromised? So, what are your thoughts on that and what can be done? So maybe over to you, Hanif, and then we can move to John. Yeah.
Yes. All East African dictators, I would call them, read from the same WhatsApp group. Every tactic you see them using, especially during the uprising in different countries, they are all the same. They all support each other. They would come out openly to support each other. But ironically, they would condemn us for having the same cross-border solidarity. So you would see them surveilling protesters, shutting down the internet, especially during election period. I hope that doesn't happen in Kenya, but you're seeing the MPs recently just trying to ban TikTok. They're initiating for TikTok to be banned and social media in general because they fear. They're the ones who are actually fearing. So the surveillance part, actually, I moved out of our place because of that fear. I fear that I was being watched and that I was a risk to people close to me. And it's actually true. You would see government bloggers and account sharing information that was personal to me and where I currently was staying. So you would just see them sharing information about me that no one else knows, that is not in the public. And that is how I knew we are really seriously being watched. And every time we get arrested, we were encouraged to not use the phone again. When you're taken to the police station, the DCI, the police would take your phone and then they tell you to come for it after 1 week. Like Mwabili, the activist in Kenya who was just released after being arrested, he was told to come for his gadgets 1 week later. And it is the same case with everyone, every activist who is arrested. So we are being watched all the time. We're being targeted. They're trying to intimidate us. We're always living in fear. We don't even know. I can't even be comfortable around people because they of course see me as a risk. And I see myself as a risk to them as well. It's a very bitter life to live, but we have to fight against this until the end. And like
Yeah,
Rose
and
Jerry also. I think you
yeah.
remember Rose Jerry,
Yes,
how
yes.
she explained the spyware thing. She was arrested. She was actually very shocked. Rose wasn't loud on social media. She just shared a tool that would help Kenyans practice their civic duty. They caught her, tracked her down up to where she was. That is actually very scary. I don't know how it's they tracked her down up to where she was. She was very scared, by the way. And they took her to the cell, took her gadgets as well. After a few days, it was discovered, especially with the lawyers as well, that they had indeed installed spyware into her phone. She is a tech girl, so she would know better as well. So yes, the surveillance is crazy and it's getting crazier each day. And we're fearing more because the elections are coming up. We don't know who they're targeting, what they are up to, and I don't know. There's just so many things going on.
Yeah,
Yeah.
maybe just John, over to
Sorry,
you.
go ahead.
Yeah. So I was just saying over to you, and yeah,
Okay.
focusing on the East Africa side and the surveillance bit as well.
All right. So I'd say that what we are seeing now is authoritarians or people in power moving from this new shiny thing to learning how it works, to systematizing it, and then now franchising it across the country. And what I mean by that is renditions, kidnappings, transnational repression is not new, right? We had Seth Sendashonga killed outside of the Rwanda embassy in 2007. We've had dissidents from as far as Turkey being, kidnapped outside from inside the nation center in Nairobi. There were people from the FDC, the opposition party, that were kidnapped and taken across the border in Uganda. Maria Sehai's experience, where she almost made, she was almost taken across the border.
The Pesige, who is still in prison in
Besigye, who is
Uganda,
still
he
in
was
prison.
kidnapped in Kenya.
He
Yeah,
was kidnapped in Nairobi, right? So what you're seeing is the status quo learning. The same way we learn, they learn, and they're able to learn and adopt at scale in ways that we are not yet able to as members of the public, right? And so what you see as this network is actually kind of two systems growing in tandem with one another, two systems that talk to each other growing in tandem with one another. But there's a more, I think, sinister or more worrying plot point that we also need to consider, which is what is the impact of the global infrastructure for surveillance on what is happening at home, right? And this is where the conversation about companies like Palantir, AI companies, Anthropic, etc., whose technology is being used for surveillance at scale in the countries where, in the countries where these things were created, right? Why that's important to focus on is because in this new AI age, where is the money going, right? Where is the money that is supporting the building, the development of AI going first? It's going into the biggest, into the biggest industry from the largest economy in the world, which is the military, industrial, and defense industry, right? And the outcomes of that is a surveillance infrastructure that's so large and so vast that people now who have been learning and growing and getting from stage to stage are now able to adopt that, right? I was, I did a video just yesterday talking about this. This is now fortress capitalism, essentially, right? And it's a model that works very well, interestingly, at this point in history, because there are two or three things that have merged. The development of the technology, first of all, is at a place where it's scalable, right? The money to keep this train going is available, yeah. And that has its roots in the 2008 global financial collapse and where capital then moved to, going forward. And the third thing is, especially in the largest country in the world, you have a president that is completely abandoning the rules or the international rules-based order in support for might is right kind of order where power transactionalism works, right? Look at the national security strategy. It's all there, right? I think that's the thing about Trump. Like, he telegraphs everything that he's going to do, and then he does it. And because the United States is so influential, even in a multipolar world, the kinds of things that he's looking at, the kinds of friends he's associating with, then now feel emboldened to start using the methodologies that they use. When it comes to surveillance, right? When I was being surveilled, as a young journalist, it was about me, right? It was about finding where I am, sometimes even physically tailing me, right? What the Rose Njeri's experience is far more typical of what's going to happen going forward. And it's not just going to be with the collaboration or with the participation of the security state. There's other parts of our economy and our country whose infrastructure is built for this very thing. I'll give you an example, right? When Kenyans registered for the Social Health Authority, you register your location, right? Which means that, and you're registering on a digital platform, which means that not only do they know what your health data is, they know where you live, right? Right now, the Kenya Revenue Authority is looking at deploying AI agents to ensure that you can estimate turnover based on mobile transactions, meaning that they are in your phone, they know how much you spend, they know where you spend it, they know what your spending habits are. So the model of surveillance has moved from being one of, a cat and mouse to this gilded cage where everybody is being surveilled, and all they need to do is combine the right kind of data points to get who it is that they want. That's the larger conversation that we ought to have, because what will happen in Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania will always be a model for what happens elsewhere. It's easier to try it because our laws and our leaders are more adept to this kind of rulership. But the real question is, what will the global infrastructure for surveillance tell us about what we need to do, about our laws, about how we ally ourselves with each other, how we collaborate if the global, if the global order is about transactionalism, surveillance, and the putting down of dissent in that way?
Okay, and that's very interesting. And I think one thing that comes out to me, even when we talk about the capacity for power to learn, is that we should never underestimate the fact that power has the capacity to learn, and that power will always have powerful tools. Yeah. And that I think that's a very, very important thing for us to keep in mind. One of the things I think also that I've also come to pay attention to when it comes to looking into the surveillance aspect is, Zeynep Tufekci says that, when you think about repression, especially in its most physical sense, right, you know how to prepare for, I dare say, you know how to prepare for bullets, right? You know how to prepare when a policeman is running after you with a baton. You know how to prepare for the physical elements of even being tailed, and for the physical elements of being attacked. But the kind of repression that is followed, that is enabled by by surveillance infrastructure, I think is something that can literally, I think, extract untold amounts of fear on people. And so there's a big, big question about what necessarily the future of freedoms looks like if we continue to feed the monster. Yeah, because that's ideally where we are going. And I think Kenya in particular is at the forefront of feeding the monster, because we've got a huge amount of digital public infrastructure. We've got a huge amount of a large amount of our cash flow in the country is largely digital, right? And perhaps these are the questions we should have asked ourselves when we started thinking about transferring large amounts of our monetary system over to Safaricom with M-Pesa. What is the actual freedom that we're giving up when we think about using digital cash? I do know that there are people who've talked about the idea that, using digital cash is in some ways actually giving up our freedoms to some extent.
It is.
So I think that there is room for us to maybe engage with that thought and think about it. And for a spanner in the works, and maybe ask one last question before we move over to Q&A, and then give you guys a chance for closing remarks, which is, in very quick, short answer, what do you think is more predictive of what's going to happen in the 2027 elections? Our own internal domestic strife, or the broader patterns in the region where elections are to be tolerated but not lost? So yeah, I think
Hanifa, why don't you take a stab at it first?
let's start with Hanifa, and then we just a quick one, then we can move to Q&A. For the audience, please, I think you can put your questions in the Q&A, and we'll be able to get to them and answer them. Yeah.
Okay, I can't tell who is going to win the election in 2027, but one thing we know is how the Kenyan politics works. I was in a session today and we were taught about learning your voters and how the voters are in each country. Like in Kenya, you'll say they lean on tribalism. Tribalism is what drives the Kenyan politics. That is something we're looking forward to, I don't know, tackle. We can't realistically get rid of tribalism 100%. And we are not organized enough, I think, until 2027 to actually achieve the kind of change that we want. So what we can do now is try until the end, try to organize, try to get as much youth as we can into power and into parliament. We have poor youth representation in Kenya, like really poor. And of course, women presentation in power as well. So as youths, and my part also, I'm really trying to rally behind all these youths who are trying to take up power.
Okay,
Thank you.
great. John, just a quick one before we go into Q&A.
Yeah, so I think that those predicting that there'll be violence of the sort that Uganda and Tanzania have had, I think I wouldn't go as far as saying that there will be that kind of violence or that kind of repression. I'll just point at some of the areas that will be contested. Number one is the digital space, right? Who is going to get the initiative over the public square? Who uses that most efficiently, right? When it comes to repression, I think that it's a given that the security state will be used in certain ways to repress public debate, to repress organizing, because we're already seeing that happening, right? I think what the solution is to ensure how do we protect the public spaces for debate. But what essentially it comes down to is something that's encapsulated in the current debate that we're having in Kenya between the opposition splinter groups in ODM versus the government. Articulated by Sifuna this way: a dictator can build roads. What he's talking about is how do we ensure that the soul of the nation is protected in this exercise versus how do we ensure that the outcomes of perceived development don't win the day, right? Materialism and transactionalism. So I think that's where the debate is going to lie. That the tools of how that is going to play out, I'm not quite sure about.
And the use of guns, the political violence, and mostly the use of guns. If you check last year's protest, it majorly died down because of guns. Guns really infiltrated the protest. They robbed people, they vandalized their businesses. Unfortunately, they also, some women also sexually assaulted. So the use of guns is something we should really watch out for. Honestly, I don't want to say this or be negative, but it scares me. They're going to be used. Unfortunately, the poverty is still something that is manufactured and engineered by politicians. That is a tactic that has existed for decades, a tactic that we should watch out for. And I think we should be more understanding of how voters work, how the political the dynamics for us to truly get over this.
For sure. And yeah, anyway, and I'll save my points for maybe the question and answer round. Yeah.
Okay, so if anybody has a question, please just put them in the webinar chat, and then we can get our panelists to answer. So I don't know if anybody in the chat has any questions, because I can't see
We have 3 questions.
Well, I'm not seeing any questions so far. So I think what we'll do, because I know we're short on time. Or Erin?
There's one from Onesmo.
Oh, you can see them. I can't see them.
Yeah. All right. I'll take over your job a little for a second and just the question.
Oh, I've seen them. Oops,
Oh, you've seen
sorry.
them, right?
I can see them.
Okay.
Yeah, but go ahead. I think I can see Advocate Onesmo from Tanzania, currently at Columbia University. He says, how do we sustain the Gen Z movement because they seem to be spontaneous and event-based? Yeah, just quickly. Yeah.
I think what will sustain any political interest from the Gen Z, the Gen Z demographic in Tanzania and Uganda is how do we keep them engaged in the places where they already are, right? So and this is why the person, and that's what I was talking about, then the person who wins narrative control online is very likely the person who's going to get continually energize the Gen Z to come out and vote. It's really about the public square. Where are the Gen Z? Not just who are they, but where are they and how can they be reached? Odanga, you and I have spoken about iShow Speed and the infrastructure that brought Kenyans and Ugandans out and Rwandese out, being the same infrastructure that brought people out for protest. And it is who it is that appeals most directly to that demographic, where they are and where they listen, where they shop, and where they communicate, that I think will be really important for the next election.
And if I know you probably want to chime in on this one, yeah, go ahead.
Also, apart to add on what Alan has said, we need to be organized. One thing we are not is organized. For us, the uprising started organically. We were just enraged and into the streets, and we are aggressively leaderless, which is good, by the way. Like I said, this decentralized leadership works for everyone in their own spaces and capacity. So we need to organize. I keep insisting on this. Yes, we need to get off social media as much as it is our major tool, crucial tool and platform that we own. I think social media and that solidarity is what has kept this movement still going. I wouldn't call us still a movement, but yeah, the young people especially engaged in politics. If you check how the social media was and is right now, it's not the same. We are chronically online, and we are chronically politically active. That matters, I think. I want to focus on what brings us together rather than what separates us all. So we need to get organized, find our spaces. How do we, again, insist on this, support and rally behind every young person, of course, with integrity, and any young person who is competent to get into politics, get into parliament. Yeah, so
Okay.
organizing in our different spaces.
Okay, there's a question here from Shreya asking about, given the surveillance and the AI regimes, especially as these technology companies are based in the global north, is it fair to say that data is the new extractive colonial resource? And what, in your opinion, is the ideal way to resist this now digital regime? So I'll give that to John Allen, and then Hanif, I'll give you one more question, and then we can close it out. So John Allen, maybe 30 seconds.
Interesting. Yeah, I think it's both a resource and a tool to be able to understand the societies in which we live. And I'd say this is why like the kind of health pacts that you're seeing the United States trying to sign with various governments around the world, Anthropic getting into partnership with Rwanda, etc. You're going to see a lot more of that because they understand that through our data, they'll be able to know us, right? In the same way that they did during colonial times through our customs, they were able to then to destroy us. But some of the raw resources are still the same, and this is why you're seeing almost like a remapping of relationships that are directly correlated with the raw resources that are required to power the AI the AI age, the negotiations on mining in Congo and different parts of the world, to be able to own downstream mining resources by the United States. You're going to see a lot more of that.
Okay, and then Hanifa, this one is to you. You mentioned the influence of global politics, the influence of global politics in the dictatorship mentality in Africa. How could we create a global rights movement to counteract the dictatorship ideology? What would it take?
I think it's already happening. Like I said, the cross-border solidarity, it's good to connect with each other. That really annoys them. That is why they come out to support each other openly, and that is what we should do also. Like how Kenyans literally begged to be let into Tanzania when the protests were happening. It was something amazing. When the internet was shut down in Tanzania, we had Kenyans supporting them online thoroughly up until the elections were over. They became their voices. So I insist on solidarity a lot, the cross-border solidarity more so, because it is what scares these dictators. It really, really scares them. That is why they tried their best to divide us. They tried their best to mock us, to kill our morale. We have so many different groups and forums that bring people together from different countries, especially East Africa and Africa as a whole, to create such platform and spaces for us to act and look for situations and the way forward in what affects each and every one of us in our respective countries. So the cross-border solidarities and coming out in such spaces and workshops.
Okay, great. So we have 1 minute left. I just want to ask the both of you, this is a minute just for you to share with the audience, what are you paying attention to? Is there anything you're working on with regards to this respect that you want them to think about? And finally, what gives you hope, right? So what are you paying attention to? Are you working on anything interesting that you want to let the audience know about? And what gives you hope? So we can start with John Allen. You go, and then Hanifa, you can close us out, and then I think we should be good to go. Yeah.
I think what I'm paying attention to is how how money is transforming the global architecture of law, politics, and economy, and how that's affecting Africa through the kind of agreements that are taking place. What I'm working on is how journalism can respond to not just the issues of today, but be not just a signal, but a service in a much more detailed and perhaps participatory way with the audience. So community is a very big conversation piece that I'm thinking about. Also how African philosophies can create a new foundation for how we approach the world as journalists, as civic and organizers, as leaders. What gives me hope, interestingly, are the conversations that I have with my kids, because I see them as like a representation of what's going to be happening and the kind of political astuteness that they have about not just local, but global politics. And, whereas in the past, people might say that, yeah, but, you're middle class, your kids have certain kinds of access. This access is everywhere now on the continent with regard to the kind of resources. So I love, I don't know if I should call it academic TikTok, but these rabbit holes that you can go into that really have very rich information, and that I'm finding younger and younger and younger Kenyans talking about things that I used to take weeks and weeks mining information for, and talking to them, speaking to these subjects in such a way that it's so simple, it's so organic, and it's so interesting. So I, despite everything, I really have a lot of hope that people who are digital natives will be able to resolve the digital challenges that we're talking about today.
So Hanifa, over to you. So
Okay,
what are you paying
yeah,
attention
okay.
to? What are
I'm
you
paying
working on, and what
attention
gives you
to
hope?
something
Yeah.
not as cool as John's, but there's this political violence topic, especially us nearing the general election in 2027. I want people to see it differently. I see goons as victims of political manipulation. If we want to actually change how voters think and what they do. Of course, we can't do it in such a short time, but what are we doing towards changing such problem? So I want to educate people on that. I'm really trying my best to make them see this differently, to get out of that moral pedestal. They're thinking that we are morally superior to these people. And I don't know, how do we best curb what is to come with the goonism situation? Of course, you cannot tell a hungry man to not accept 200 shillings. That is actually his meal for the day. How do we learn about people, connect with them, try to make them understand instead of thinking we are morally superior to them? That is what I'm trying to work on, because I grew up in such a place also. I had the privilege of getting out, getting an education, and being in this space that I am. So how best can I really connect to these people and, turn the situation around? It is there. I have so much hope for this. I have seen what the youths are capable of. I have seen what we can do despite all the challenges over the past 2 years. So I have so much hope in the dream of a redefined Kenya. I have so much hope in the youths of the world in general. We have seen in 2024, 2025, what has happened and globally. We are the change. We need to fight for the next generation as well. So I hope we don't give up. There's so much hope. I'm really hopeful about that. Thank you.
Okay, great. So thank you, and thank you to our guests. Thank you, Hanifa. Thank you, John Allen, for coming for this session. And thank you to all our attendees in the chat. Thank you to all those who asked questions, those within the Harvard ecosystem as well. Thank you so much. And of course, a big thank you to you, Erin. I know you're in the shadows operating everything, and to the Carr-Ryan Center for hosting this conversation. We will have 2 more conversations looking into the state of rights in Uganda and the state of rights in Tanzania with additional guests. We've got people like Agatha Tuhaire who will be coming up. I know we will also be looking to try and get Larry Mado to actually come here to Harvard for the JFK Forum. So hopefully we're actually going to have a physical event here as well. So please be on the lookout for all of those. And thank you to you, Hanifa, and thank you, John. Thank you so much for coming. And please let us keep the conversation going. I think there will be a recording available for this that will be shareable on YouTube as well for people to look into that. Thank you. At least we can be able to
for
miss the
having
both of
me.
you. Thank you so much for coming.
Thanks a lot, guys.
Thank you.
Asante.
Cheers.
Bye.
Cheers.